Welcome, everybody. Thanks very much for coming out on this rainy day. I want to welcome you to our Spring Like May lunch webinar. I'm really glad you're going to be here. I think we have a very not only informative but fun presentation for you today. Just wanted to go through a quick, and we've got a lot to cover, so I'm going to talk quickly. If you are looking for certified association executive credit, that's available today if you're in the room. If you have any issues, the information is on the slide, which you have on your table, but if you have any questions, come up to us afterwards. And I want to promo our June lunch, which is, hopefully the weather will be more June-like, is not actually a lunch. We're shaking things up a little, and moving the program to late afternoon so we can go right into a reception out on the balcony here and along, so it should be beautiful. That'll be, so June 14th, 3:30 for networking, 4 to 5:30 for the presentation, and then 5:30 on for the reception. Wine, delicious hors d'oeuvres, whatever, and the presentation is on fundraising, which is something that many nonprofits have in common. So looking forward to that. Then we're taking a summer break, July and August off. Hope you're taking a summer break too, and we will see you in September where our lunch, this is a top secret reveal, will be on donor advised funds. So look for that. Let me go ahead and introduce our speakers. Ron Jacobs. This is Ron here. Ron is the co-chair of Venables Political Law Group. We have one of the biggest bipartisan political practices in the city. Ron does the full, represents a lot of nonprofits, trade associations, works closely with the nonprofit group. The nonprofit and political group are basically one. He also does the full range of legal issues from campaign finance to lobbying disclosure, gift rules, ethics, and of course the tax overlay over all of that. Larry Norton, who is the other co-chair of the political law group, was going to be here today, former general counsel of the FEC. Isn't able to be here, but I'm very happy to introduce Jim Terrell, who's also in the Venable Political Law Group, who has many years of experience working on the same issues for the same kinds of clients that I just mentioned for Ron, and who also worked at the FEC for the FEC chair. So we've got a lot of experience for you. I'm Cindy Lewin. Before I came to Venable, I'm a partner in the nonprofit organizations practice group. Before I came to Venable, I was the executive vice president and general counsel at AARP. So have some certainly involvement in lobbying. And before that, I worked for the National Wildlife Federation, where we had environmental group, where we had a 501c3 organization, a 501c4 organization, and a PAC. And so today, instead of sort of marching through the black letter law of all of this, we've put together some hypotheticals for you, and I'm going to play the client, which I've experienced doing because I used to be Ron's client. So quickly, what we're going to cover, political activity, how you can support and interact with candidates, special rules for 501c3s, if you want to have a PAC, how does that work? And a lot of people feel that the action these days, given the gridlock in Washington, is state and local. So state and local is becoming a more and more important part of what all of us are doing, so we'll cover that. We have a lot to cover, but we'd like to take questions along the way, so raise your hands. And I'm also going to try to keep an eye on questions coming in through the webinar with Camille's help up here. So we'll do our best to get to questions, and we'd love to hear what's on your minds. So why does this matter? I think so many nonprofits, an important part of getting their mission fulfilled does require legislative change. How do you get that? How are you heard? It may be a shock, but I understand in this town money talks. I think delivery of votes talks. And in my experience, fantastic research papers has a quiet voice, a limited voice. So I think that for many of what our nonprofit clients are trying to do, knowing how and when and where to participate in the political process is an important part of accomplishing their mission. Ron and Jim, do you have?
Only that you're such a cynic, Cindy.
I know. Where did I get that? It's shocking. Anything you want to add here? So obviously you got to know, so what are the risks of doing this? There are a lot of rules. I think one of the people fall into the trap so much of, oh, well, I followed the FEC rules. Oh, well, there are all these IRS rules, and aren't they totally consistent? That would be too easy. What would we do for work if that were true? There are a lot of people, so it's complicated. You have to know what you're doing. There are traps for the unwary, and of course, people are watching. So, your reputation can be affected, your pocketbook can be affected, and your credibility can be affected. Anything else you want to say? So with that background, so Ron, my college roommate is running for office. I love her. I really do. She's fantastic. I know if I have her come to the office and meet some of my colleagues, they're going to love her too. And I think we can really change the world if we can get her into office. So I'm going to bring her in. And yeah, I probably will kind of hit people up over the lunch while we're there. So that's fine, right?
Oh, yeah, just fine. If you give me the clicker. So right. The good answer, the good thing about political law is that usually there's a way to accomplish what you want to do. There's a way to have that lunch. There's a way to have the candidate in to someone can pay for the food, and you can ask for contributions. The trick is making sure you do it right. And so one of the things I think with any of these scenarios that we're talking about is to understand sort of the who, what, why, where, when, and how of the of what you want to do. So Cindy came in and said the office. So the question is, well, whose office? Is this a 501c6 trade association? Is this a 501c3? Is this a member of a trade association, a company, a Washington office that someone has? All those are very important because the answer will depend on exactly what it is. If it's a 501c3, it's a much harder scenario to have someone in the office. There's the risk of campaign intervention, much better to do it somewhere else than in the C3's office. If it's a C4, if it's a C6, if it's a company, a member of a trade association, usually there's going to be a way to do it in the office. But part of that depends on which candidate this is. If it's a candidate running for Congress, then we have the federal rules to play with. If it's a candidate running in Virginia for governor or the Virginia State House, you can do almost anything under Virginia law. It's much easier. In Maryland, there are limits on how much you can do, but corporations, C4s, C6s, C5s, and for-profit companies can all pay for the cost of that lunch and treat it as an in-kind contribution. The federal level, as we'll talk about, there are prohibitions on corporate contributions, so you have to fit it into a particular exemption. And then, depending on which exemption you're going to use, the question is, well, who's going to come? Are they going to be your members? Just your friends and family, people from the office? That all depends on exactly how the project will work. And then, depending on the answers to these questions, who pays becomes important. Are you sending out the invitations? Sorry, I realized that I have each slides for each of these different points that we're talking about. Who will be invited? And then who will be sending out the invitations depends on if you're trying to use the corporate contribution rules that allow certain things to happen or whether you are paying for it individually. And so with all of these different issues to consider, I kind of break it down into sort of 4 options for how you can do a fundraiser like this. And so I'll give you the quick highlights, and then Jim is going to jump into the more specific rules on each of these. So the one way to do all of these is to say, you know what, the candidate can just pay. They can rent the room, they can pay for the food, and easy. You avoid kind of all these rules. The other option is maybe the organization pays, but if it does, then it's got to fit into some very specific rules about who's invited to the event, depending on whether it's a federal or state candidate. If you have a PAC, if you're a C6 or C4 or a company and you have a political action committee, there's ways to use the PAC to pay for it. And then if all those fail, if you're not going to be able to do that, have an individual pay who can treat it as an in-kind contribution, presuming there are limits there. So those are kind of the 4 options. Jim, I'll turn it over to you to kind of walk through each of those.
Thanks, Ron. Did I press this one? Yeah. Okay, so the first scenario here is pretty much the most simple scenario. And oftentimes you'll get candidates, whether it's federal or state, who frankly just prefer this. So there's no issues as far as corporate reporting or PAC reporting. But it's a simple way. The candidate just pays for it. Whether that's the room, whether that's the catering, entertainment, whatever it may be, whatever kind of food or beverage is at an event, the candidate just pays for it. And it's just an expenditure of the candidate. The PAC or the corporation doesn't have any kind of reporting obligations, and as long as far as on the federal level, that's paid within a commercially reasonable time, which is typically around 30 days, then there's no issues as far as reporting goes. Now, one way that you can kind of get tripped up on here is if the candidate is paying for everything. They're paying for the catering. They're paying for, for the room usage, pretty much everything about the event. But you happen to tell some administrative staff that they really need to organize. They need to organize the event as far as keeping up the RSVP list, things like that. And that can actually be an in-kind contribution if the administrative staff is being told to do so by executives, and it's more of a substantial time period that the administrative staff does this. So that's something to be careful of with respect to situations where a candidate is saying that they are going to they're going to pay for the event, but keep in mind the use of staff.
Jim, are you saying that if they did this at a 501c3 office, if the candidate paid for the room, that they could do it at a 501c3?
If they paid for a room at a 501c3 and there was, it was made very clear that there's no candidate endorsement and there's no candidate interaction, there's no materials that are being presented by the C3 or C3 executives showing support for a candidate, as long as it's paid in full for the use of the room, would typically be fine.
And that the room would be available to others.
That's
on
exactly
that
right.
kind of
Exactly. Yeah, it's sort of a commercial
fair
transaction.
market value basis.
Right. So the next sort of option. Let's see here.
One thing, if on that the volunteer staff piece too is. A lot of times if you work with a candidate's fundraiser to host the event, the fundraiser takes the RSVPs and handles that kind of thing that you otherwise might have an administrative staff to deal with. So if you work with the candidate's organization, a lot of that gets offloaded, so you don't have to worry about asking your administrative assistant to collect the collect RSVPs, things like that.
Absolutely true. So the second scenario would be the organization pays for the event. And that's where we sort of run into the FEC's rules regarding who can attend the event, how is it paid for, and the general rule with regards to hosting candidate fundraiser at the actual organization. The only folks who are able to go to that event are members or employees, salaried employees, basically what's referred to as the restricted class. The organization can plan it. The staff can carry out the event. The organization pays all the costs. Individuals at the organization cannot collect contributions for that particular candidate, but the candidate can come in and solicit the restricted class of the organization as long as it's limited to just the restricted class.
So this is one that a lot of even candidates don't know about. They get very nervous when you say that the company can actually pay for the lunch, but it's a very clear FEC rule where if you're only inviting your restricted class, your members, if you're a membership organization, your executive employees, if you're a business, if you're a trade association, the individuals with whom you normally conduct business, if you limit it to that, you actually can pay for all the costs, as Jim said. But it's one, at least the candidates don't often know about it because it's such a sort of an obscure part of the rules, but it is a very useful way to do things.
And another kind of a bit of an obscure part of the rules as well with regard to the FEC's regulations is that if the costs exceed $2,000, there's a form that needs to be filed. Basically, it's considered communications. If it exceeds $2,000, that needs to be filed with the FEC. If the cost for the event exceeds $2,000. So, touching on some of the other issues.
Yeah, question.
When you say members only, do you have to invite all your members? Do you invite all your members, or can you just select members to invite?
There's no requirement that all members need to be invited to these events, but they're the attendees and the folks you can invite are restricted just to members.
Right. You could pick a subset. You could say we want to invite people in D.C. We could invite people who we know to be interested in this candidate or that maybe their facilities are in their district. You can definitely select. You don't have to do it on a nonpartisan or an all or nothing kind of basis. But again, this would apply, the one thing to keep in mind here is that this applies to organizations that are not C3s, basically. A C3 can't invite its members to do a fundraiser this way because then it would be C3 campaign intervention. So that's one piece.
Okay.
And that brings us sort of to the next slide. 501c3s, so if an organization is organized as a 501c3, again, as Ron said, they cannot host these types of fundraisers where they're paying for the administrative costs and everything associated with an event, even if it's just the restricted class. And so if there's a 501c3 that has a sister 501c4 organization, it's the 501c4 organization that should hold the event, not the C3. And that should be very clear on any kind of invitations that are sent out or anything that's said during the event.
And actually, that's another interesting thing. When you have a parallel organization, sister C4, you want to make sure that the C3 and the C4 share the members. If you're a C3 that has individual members and the C4 doesn't actually have the members, that would be the problem because you wouldn't be able to invite the members of the C4. So you have to make sure you structure the arrangement between the two organizations as such that the C4 also has the members.
Question?
Hi. Oh gosh, that's loud. If we are a 501c3 and we would like to host a candidate but not frame it as a fundraiser, frame it more as a listening session or some other event where they're just coming to speak, could we do that in our own premises, or because we're a 501c3 we shouldn't even try?
So if a member or a candidate is coming in to a C3, then it's sort of a meet and greet, right? Mm-hmm. It should the content of the speech or the presentation that member gives should not be campaign related. So if they want to come in and talk about certain policy issues or certain bills, that's you're able to do that, okay, as long as it's not any kind of campaign related, and not, as long as the organization is not showing any kind of endorsement of the individual who's coming to show up.
Okay, excellent. Thank you.
So the next slide touches on the corporate issue with regard to states. A number of states permit corporate contributions, and so for instance, Maryland is a $6,000 limit from corporations and individuals to statewide candidates, and so the organization in that context can actually pay for the event and have it counted as an in-kind contribution. So if a corporation or a membership organization wants to host an event for a gubernatorial candidate in Maryland, they can do that, and they can basically use up their $6,000 limit as a corporation to make an in-kind contribution to the candidate in the form of catering or room costs. As long as there's a fair market value assigned to all of that, then that's permissible as well. The next option for payment is if an organization's PAC pays. So whether it's a corporation or a trade association PAC or membership PAC, the PAC can pay for an event or a fundraiser event for whether it's a federal office holder or a state office holder, and the amount would basically just count as an in-kind contribution as well. And so that would be reported on the PAC's reports. It would be the receipt of the in-kind contribution would be reported on the candidates' reports that are filed, whether with the Federal Election Commission or a state agency. The PAC can pay for everything. It's basically treated as an in-kind contribution, like a regular contribution, subject to the limits. One caveat with that is that the staff, any kind of staff involvement in the planning, whether that's folks staying late for a reception or administrative staff keeping an RSVP list, that must be paid for by the PAC. and it must be paid, as on the federal level at least, it must be paid in advance of the services. So that's a little bit different from the scenario earlier where it needed to be paid within a commercially reasonable time. If the PAC is paying for it, then it needs to be paid basically to the company before the event actually occurs, so for catering or some sort of any kind of services that are provided at the event needs to be paid beforehand. And lastly, and this typically comes up in scenarios where maybe a separate segregated fund, a federal PAC, wants to pay for an event, a fundraising event, but perhaps the costs of the event exceed the limit for that particular PAC to the federal office holder or candidate. Oftentimes, you'll have an individual, whether it's an executive or someone at the company, chipping in their personal money to cover the excess amount, the excess cost for the event. And that's also permissible, and that would simply be an in-kind contribution from the individual that supplements the in-kind contribution from the PAC itself. And then one piece on that is sometimes events are not going to be actually at the office. They'll be at an executive's home. Basically, this is really just a home event exemption. And so the individual can pay up to $1,000 per election for things like food and catering without that actually counting as an in-kind contribution to the candidate. So if the bill for catering and food and drinks is a certain amount of money, you can subtract $1,000 off of that, and it would not count as an in-kind contribution.
I think there's a question in the audience.
Yes. Can we combine some elements of different options here? For example, if we have a 501c5, if there are one or more PACs who want to pay for food and beverage and costs like that at an event, we'd like to provide our office space. Can the organization provide office space and staff as under the organization pays option, but have the PACs pay for other costs of the event?
You would, so when the one I think way to think about this is when you do the organization pays and you fit under the federal exemption, it really has to be the organization paying and the just limited to members. If you want the PACs to pay for it, you can do that, but then the PACs have to cover the administrative cost and pay the company or the C5 for their the time and the staff and cover all the costs there. You can't have a members-only thing but include people outside the membership and then have someone else pay. So that you do have to kind of decide to do it one way or the other up front. No, if it's members only, the PACs could pay for it. Absolutely, yeah. And then we've been talking a lot about sort of the limits. We wanted to show just what the contribution limits are for federal limits. We'll talk in a second about the states, but just as a reminder, individuals get $2,700 per election, multi-candidate PACs $5,000 to candidates. So just can't keep those in mind.
Great. Okay, so speaking of states, my college roommate who I was talking about is running for a state office, and I want to help her. I'm ready to mortgage my house. So what can I do? And what can you do on behalf of my organization? And what do we have to file?
Okay. So don't mortgage your house yet. Save that. So first thing is to think about the organizations. And we talked about how at the federal level, you're not allowed to make corporate contributions. A lot of states actually allow for corporate contributions. And so this chart here shows where there are some states where it's unlimited corporate contributions, other states where there are limits. Some of those limits are very low. New York has aggregate corporate contribution limits, so it's a very low number, so don't get too excited there. And then in other states, they are prohibited. So keep that in mind as one of your options before you mortgage the house. Now, I don't think as a nonprofit you could use your funds to support your college roommate that way. There's got to be a connection, but that's one option. To give you a sense of some of the states, so Maryland, as Jim mentioned, there's a $6,000 per election cycle limit. That's corporate and individual, so you could write a check for $6,000 to your friend. So hopefully you don't have to mortgage the house quite yet to get there. Spouses have separate limits. And then in the gubernatorial elections, the governor and the lieutenant governor sort of technically run separately. So you can give $6,000 to the governor, $6,000 to the lieutenant governor from each individual. And then there are other sort of accounts that exist in many states. So if you do want to support your friend generously, there are political party accounts. And then even in Maryland, where there are limits on how much you give to the political party accounts, there are separate administrative accounts that technically can't be used for actual election intervention, but they sure figure out some way to take the money and use it for something. So there are all, in the states, there are a lot of different options and different things you can do. California is just another to kind of contrast states on other opposite sides of the country. California has limits, individual limits, business entity limits, so corporate contributions are allowed, and then PAC limits. And as you can see, with California, they sort of recognize the size and scope of running for governor, and they've actually allow individuals, businesses, and PACs up to almost $30,000 per election. So I hope your friend's not in California. The mortgage may have to be raised
Right,
there.
especially since you said my spouse can give, and my kids, even if they're young, are they minors? So I can just keep adding it up as long as I don't include the dog.
So you're not, one of the things to keep in mind with children, minors generally are allowed to contribute, but it has to be their own money and their own decision to do so. So you can't just sort of give a $29,000 Christmas present to your kids and then have them write the check. So you have to be careful about that. The states have other issues to consider when you're making state contributions. A lot of states prohibit contributions during the legislative session. So Maryland is a state that prohibits contributions during the legislative session. If you're a sitting governor, if you're a sitting member of the state house, you can't take contributions while they're in session. The opponents, however, can. I'm amazed they haven't figured out a way to close that loophole for the incumbents, but they haven't. So you're not allowed to give during the legislative session. There are a number of states that limit lobbyists and what they do, whether they make contributions or whether they can hold fundraisers, things like that. So be careful if you're a registered lobbyist in those states or if your organization is registered to lobby. A few states have requirements if you're going to make organization contributions for the board to authorize the contribution, so be aware of those. And then the final piece here is, without diving too far into the tax code, because while Cindy did talk about the tax implications, I don't want to kill you over lunch over the tax code, but there is an important piece here, is that political spending is subject to tax under Section 527F. It's one of the strangest taxes in all of the tax code, I think. You pay tax on the lesser of your net investment income or your political activity. So if you wrote a $6,000 check in Maryland to a candidate and that was your only corporate political expenditure, and you had zero investment income, you would pay tax on that $6,000. If you had investment income of $10,000 and you made a series of contributions that exceeded $10,000, you would pay tax on the $10,000. It's a very odd tax, but it's something to consider. We have a question.
And it's the tax, while we're waiting for the question, it's the tax at the regular corporate rate, which just
was decreased.
Way down.
Yes, so it is less of a tax burden than it was before. So there's your tax relief is on your political contributions.
Yeah.
On the 527F, is that just in Maryland, or does that vary per state?
No, it's a tax imposed by the federal tax code. Okay. I was using the Maryland example of $6,000. You could, if you were in California and you made a $29,000 contribution, if you made contributions all over the country at various levels, it would be the total that you're taxed on.
And these are just contributions to state candidates, not federal.
Right, because you can't make corporate contributions to state candidates, or can't make corporate contributions to federal candidates. Exactly. One of the other things that comes into play with state contributions are donor disclosure. There are rules on when you have to disclose. Typically, when you think of it at the federal level, the recipients are the ones who disclose. If Cindy writes that $2,700 check to her college roommate who's running for Congress, the candidate discloses that $2,700. In other states, particularly if you make contributions from the nonprofit, from a C5, from a C6, there are reporting obligations on the donor if you get above a certain threshold. And then as you start to get into different scenarios, there are issues where not only do you disclose XYZ Association as the donor, but there are situations where you have to then disclose donors to the association or the nonprofit. We're going to talk about those a little more in another scenario later, but just want to kind of flag that as a potential issue where there's a lot of disclosure that can happen.
Okay, we've got another question.
Hi. Considering that the current political climate and people are interested in local elections, let's say that I have a friend in Georgia who's running for office and for Georgia office, and I want to do a fundraiser in Virginia. Should I just be looking at Georgia's political laws, or should it be looking also at Virginia for any reason?
That's a great question. So it's always the law of where the candidate is running. So if you're, in your example, candidates running in Georgia, it would be the Georgia contribution limits, the Georgia rules that would apply, even if you host the event up in Virginia.
Okay, so now we're in the 501c3 world, and I work at an environmental organization, as I mentioned. My boss, lives, and you should see his house. He's got basically a farm in the background, organic farm. He lives his personal and professional life totally integrated. He is passionate about this. He really wants to endorse a candidate in an upcoming race. I know that the organization can endorse candidates as a 501c3, but we can't trample on his individual First Amendment rights, right, Ron?
We'll actually have Jim answer this one.
Absolutely not. So first of all, I think we've already touched on it, but basic ground rules for C3s are no campaign intervention. So no contributions to candidates from the organization, no corporate resources to support them, no events there at the offices, and no endorsements. Now, First Amendment's very important, and so individuals at the C3, including your friend, is absolutely able to express his or her opinion about certain candidates, endorse candidates, as long as he or she does it in their individual capacity. And so that means no using the C3 resources to do so. You can use the title just for identification purposes. So the executive director of X corporation or X foundation, on an invitation or something along those lines, inviting them to the house for a fundraiser. But it has to clearly show that the individual is doing this in their individual capacity. And there are certain ways of doing that. We have one example here where if an individual who is in charge of a nonprofit organization writes an op-ed or has something in a newspaper, a simple disclaimer, something along the lines of the views presented here are hers and not those of the organization, that would suffice. And so one piece as far as sort of suggestions go with this, don't be taking pictures on the C3 offices doing anything candidate related or do press activity. And as far as social media goes, sometimes there can be some trip ups here. For C3, C4 sister organizations, anything that's political or that could be seen as political should be done with the C4 social media platform. So if there's a Twitter account of the C3, don't be endorsing candidates through that. Do it through the C4's Twitter account.
Jim, we have a question that came in online, and I'm not being rude in checking my email. I really am trying to keep track of the questions that I think relates to this, which is, we were talking before about renting, the C3 renting their space and candidate having an event, and the person is saying, wouldn't that look like the C3 was endorsing that candidate? And I think that goes to what you're talking about when you're saying don't use the 501c3 space. Well,
I think that's true, and I think that there are issues, as there are with any kind of political activity here. There are legal there's a legal rationale for doing things or not doing things, and there's also an optics rationale for doing things and not doing things. And I think that's always a calculus that that folks need to take. Are they going to be getting scrutiny? I mean, a lot of complaints are filed with the Federal Election Commission and other agencies that are frivolous and are done for political purposes. And so I think if it's really all about risk tolerance. Not even necessarily in the legal front, but on am I going to get some pushback for this? And so I think that's a calculus. Front.
Sure. I think if you're a C3, you should not be renting your space to candidates unless they are paying you so much money, because I think the risk there is really hard to outweigh.
I think there's also on the C3 space issue is sort of the commercial. It's not only the commercially reasonable amount, but also whether it's done on a commercial basis. So if you have, if it's just your conference room. That you don't normally make available, then you can't pick and choose which candidate you want to invite there and have them pay for it. I think one of the IRS guidance gives an example where you can rent out space in a museum. If that's done on a commercial arm's length transaction, so if you're really throwing that great fundraiser for your friend where you're renting out a museum to do it, that would be different than doing it in sort of the office space as well.
So I'm still wearing my C3 hat, and I know that there are limits on how much I can lobby. I've got depending on the test that I'm going under, either dollar limits or overall limits on my total dedication of resources. I want to spend some of that money on ads, digital ads. I'm going to do my environmental stuff. I'm going to do an ad with these little rubber ducks swimming in a polluted pond. I can see it perfectly. But, if I'm going to raise so much money about this ad that I'm going to get it on national television. So, any problems?
So, like everything in political law, it depends. A couple of basic ground rules to cover to talk about sort of how to think about this. So the first is, as we've mentioned, no campaign intervention for C3s. So you can't, if your ad were to say, if your rubber ducks said vote for Joe Blow, then we'd have a problem.
They're just saying, I'm drowning. I can't breathe.
The other piece to sort of in the framework is to think about the lobbying. As Cindy said, there's there's a limitation on C3s for lobbying. No substantial amount, which is either facts and circumstances, which we all hate, or the 501H election, which sets up particular dollar amounts, which is a great thing to do as long as you can fit within those limits. The only problem is that the 501H limits were put in place in the mid-'70s, and we've had something called inflation since then, and they've never been adjusted. And so what seemed like a ton of money on lobbying in the 1970s actually could be an overall limit today. It's a sliding scale that if an organization basically hits, I think I've done the math, and it's about $17 million in exempt purposes expenditures, you top out at $1 million in lobbying. So if you're a bigger organization than that, you're still stuck with $1 million, which is about the only reason I would say not to do the 501H election. So that's
right. And just to mention that the grassroots piece is only 25% of that, and that really can be a problem.
Exactly, particularly because grassroots is one of the more expensive things to do in many areas if you're doing TV or direct mail or things like that. So with the premise that you can't engage in campaign intervention, the IRS says, well, let's think about what it means to engage in campaign intervention. And so there are a couple of buckets that the IRS has given us of things that where you look to these. And it's not as if any one of these items makes it campaign intervention. It's the whole totality of the circumstances that come together. So just kind of working our way around the hexagon here, if the ad identifies one or more candidates, starts to make it look more like campaign intervention. So if the rubber ducks mention a candidate's name, that at least brings us into the realm of we have to think about whether it's campaign intervention as opposed to if they don't mention a candidate's name. If it approves or disapproves of the positions or actions of the candidate. So it's one thing to call on a candidate to do something in the legislature to vote a certain way before a bill is passed or not passed. It's another to thank them afterward or to say, call and tell them that their positions are terrible and that I'm drowning and can't breathe. Looking at the proximity and time to the election, so if we were running an ad in Maryland right now that called on the governor to veto a piece of legislation, we're pretty far away from the November election. We're close in time to the legislative session. He's still vetoing bills. That would make a lot of sense. If you ran that same ad at the end of October, it might look more like campaign intervention because there's nothing that the governor is actually going to do on that particular legislation then. Similarly, if you're actually referencing an election, that's sort of one of those bad facts. So you want to focus on the issues as opposed to the election to try and make sure that it's not campaign intervention. The other thing the IRS says is if you have ongoing communications that are not timed around the election. So if you are doing a regular newsletter that mentions candidates and positions and talks about legislation or issues on a regular basis, even if that comes out, if the October newsletter comes out and is similar to all the other newsletters, that's a sign that you're just engaged in your standard issue communications and that you're not focused on the election. And then also you can look to the non-electoral events. So again, if the bill is on the Senate floor in late October, because Congress hasn't finished up their work and they are not on recess yet, then that could be a non-electoral event that would be triggered as opposed to if they were already out. Looks like we have a question over here.
Does this change at all when you're talking about essentially an incumbent, so you're a current member of Congress, but you're not referring to them as a candidate, but all members of the House are always up for election? So does any of that change when you just are referring to the person as a current person in government?
So that's a great question. So if you said, call the senator and tell her to vote yes on the bill, or call and thank the senator for supporting this. That is likely going to be different than if you said call the candidate and tell them that you want them to support your position. So it's not a guarantee because, as you point out, the House members are up a lot, and you have to look to all these other indicia. So if you had a call the senator and tell her that she's terrible on these issues, and you ran that ad on October 29th, even though it's a sitting senator, if the person is up for election, the IRS could say that it's campaign intervention. So it really is there's no magic approach. Whereas if you're thinking in the campaign finance world, as Cindy mentioned, the rules don't necessarily line up. There, you really do look toward things like express advocacy, vote for, vote against. The IRS does not have that approach.
Yes, the IRS is very big on the full picture, facts and circumstances. So if you're on the fence, just imagine that conversation you're having with an IRS agent and you're explaining those facts and circumstances. See if you persuade yourself. That's a good test.
It's a good test. And these are just two examples to kind of show the difference of everything we've just talked about in terms of the one ad where it's right before an election. If it's a contentious issue in the race, that can make a difference. I've never quite understood exactly how you're supposed to decide whether an issue is contentious. All of us think our issues are the most important issues out there, and sometimes the candidates actually think so, sometimes they don't. But if it's to thank a person on a bill, that's another sign that maybe it's not quite lobbying because there's nothing to actually lobby on. The other one, the green ad here, it's timed just prior to the vote on a bill, probably grassroots lobbying, not likely to be campaign intervention. So those are kind of how you think about the two examples. And just like the IRS, who likes to give in their examples really clear-cut examples on either end of the spectrum, these are the clear-cut examples on the end of the spectrum. And so you all want to run ads that probably fit in here, and so it's a lot more thinking through, analyzing, and making sort of the judgment calls, thinking about your conversation with the IRS agent.
Okay, so I'm still working at my environmental C3, and we need to have our website redone, and I really want to think about it. I want to use the Washington Capitals colors, red, white, and blue across, and of course my C4 site, I want it to all be red, white, and blue, because what could be more American than clean air and clean water? So are there any things, and of course I have the same terms and conditions and disclaimers and privacy policies and stuff on all of them. So you're such a killjoy. What are your thoughts?
I love to get into the nuts and bolts of how to design websites. So the first part is to think about all these rules we've talked about sort of in the same way as you would for online. If it is going to be influencing legislation, or if it's campaign intervention, it's going to be the same whether it's online or on TV or in the mail. And so the difference is, of course, is that sometimes you can connect things together in a way online that you don't necessarily do with a TV ad. And so the IRS has said if you're a C3 and a C4, you want to make sure you have distinct websites. They can't just be framed around each other. They have to be two separate sites with different URLs so that it's clear which site you're on at any one time. And then the other piece to think about is that sort of taking information from one section and linking it to another. So if you do a scorecard, which you're actually allowed to do to talk about votes of incumbent officials, but then you have a blog post on your site, sort of the blog roll on the side that says, we're criticizing a member of Congress for that particular vote, then you can sort of match them up and sort of you potentially get into campaign intervention. So you want to be careful looking at all the different parts of your site of how that's going to come together. And then you've got the issue sort of separately of sort of linking to other things. What happens if you have, blogs or other third-party postings on your site? So what we suggest is that if you allow third-party content, you include a disclaimer to say, these are the views of the individuals who are posting, not the organization itself. You would not want someone to, be a regular blogger on your site or use your platform to say, hey, vote for so-and-so. You want to kind of monitor for that and take it down. Whereas if you had a posting about a particular issue and someone in the comments maybe said, hey, so-and-so is a terrible candidate for this reason, maybe less of an issue in terms of taking that down right away because it's not the organization's content. So on the linking side, a C3, really, the IRS has said it's possible to link to a candidate site, but you want to be careful of why. If you had sort of a list of all the candidates in a particular race, you could take them to the website, but you couldn't sort of use a link to endorse a candidate. So you have to think about how that works. And they've also said the number of clicks away from the website is one of the facts and circumstances. So if you were to talk about an issue here and then had a link to some third-party pages, that those third parties then had candidate links to candidates. That might be different than if you linked directly to the candidate site as well. You are allowed to link between a C3 and a C4 website, so that's an important piece. Now, the IRS said that applied to link to the homepage of the C4, not necessarily sort of a deep link into the C4's endorsement pages. So you do want to think about how that all comes together. So,
and you also want to look at the look and feel. They really can't be, the C3 and C4 can't have the same. They can't all be red, white, and blue. They can't just look like they're all the same. They have to be distinctive.
Exactly. That was the IRS actually revoked, they actually revoked the C3
did.
status based on these websites that were too intertwined and looked too much alike. It was one of those, I would love to know the backstory of the case, because I thought it would have been very easy to have tweaked the websites just a little bit, and I think you would have gotten a much different outcome in that one.
So when you're talking about the links, do you apply a 2-click rule?
So there's discussion of a 2-click rule. It doesn't actually say that you have to be 2 clicks away. And so while I would, if it's candidate advocacy, I think you'd be careful not to go directly to a campaign website. If you wouldn't want to say endorse and then, or you wouldn't want to talk about an issue and have a link to the candidate's page that you like for that supports your position. Multiple clicks would be good there. If you're doing from a C3 to a C4 where there's a PAC solicitation, I think there's not necessarily the 2-click there. I think you could go from the C3 to the C4 that could have a solicitation on that page. I'm less concerned about something like that. So there's no hard and fast rules on that.
Great. Okay, so back to my college roommate, and now I work at a trade association which has, it's represents paint manufacturers. So I want to take my college roommate on a listening tour, disguised as a listening tour, to, so I'm going to bring her not only to the trade association where I work, but to all these member companies where we work, and she'll, touch the people of America.
So this actually gets back to the question we had before a little bit about sort of the C3 concept of bringing people in. An important distinction is knowing in which capacity you're doing this kind of an event. So are they there as a candidate, or are they there as an official? Now, you can also, in that official capacity, if your friend is a business leader or someone in the community, or they work for an environmental organization, you could still invite that person in their business capacity. So you could say, hey, come see all of our paint facilities that are doing a great job protecting the environment with all of our product stewardship. But what you want to be careful of is making sure you know which role they're going to be there in. So if they're in their candidate capacity, it's going to be a campaign stop. There are FEC rules about sort of the audience that can be in the room in terms of whether it's employees or restricted class, depending on what's going to be said. And there are concerns about in-kind contributions. If you're driving the candidate, flying the candidate around, you have to worry about the campaign finance rules. In their official capacity, it's a little different. They're invited either as a sitting official or as a business person. They're not there for the campaign at all. So you want to make clear to them that that they're there to see the facility, to talk about the great stuff they're doing, but not to actually campaign and ask for people's votes. And then you don't have the campaign finance rules to deal with in terms of the gifts, but you have the issue of the gift or an ethics rules that may apply. If it's a city member of Congress, for example, there are rules about how you can give them lunch. There are rules about who can pay for the transportation there. So you just want to make sure you know which one is which. One of the sort of the bright line rules that I try to use here is, who are you talking to get that person to come? So if you're talking to the official office scheduler, it's a pretty good sign that it's someone that's going to be there in the official capacity. If you're talking to the campaign manager, then it's going to be a campaign event. And so that's a good kind of way to distinguish in your mind what kind of an event this is going to be. I think, we have a question? These are for any kind of visit. C3, C6, C5, anything like that. Now, usually what I say is it's actually easier to do an official visit because you don't have to worry about what they're going to say. A lot of times it's actually better for the organization, particularly if you're a trade association, your member company. You might not want the candidate there campaigning. Great to let the candidate there to sort of meet people and say hi and sort of do their thing without actually saying, hey, vote for me, because the employees may not particularly care for that. So I think it's usually easier to do on how you want to accomplish that. For the federal candidates, if they actually are there in the capacity as candidates, they can't ask your employees for money, which is probably a good thing. The company is not allowed to urge the employees to vote, but the candidate can. The company is allowed to urge employees to vote only if you're dealing with the restricted class, with the executive personnel of the company. So it's again, it gets a little fuzzy, and you got to make sure you're thinking very carefully about who's there and what capacity.
So we're actually at our trade association, and we do regional roundtables around the country where we invite our members and prospective members. And we've done it a few times before where we invite the member of Congress to come. He speaks. It's not campaign related. There's not a fundraiser, and it's all done in official capacity. There's no PAC event. Is that's kosher?
That's great. Yes, absolutely. So they come, they're in there in their official capacity. They're not asking for votes. They're not asking for money. You can invite anyone you want to, including the prospective members. Whereas if you were doing a fundraiser for the candidate, then you would have the issue that you'd have a non-member that you've invited. So you've done it the correct way, where you're focusing on the official office as opposed to the campaign.
Okay, so we have a PAC. We're a C3 with a C4, and through the C4 we have a PAC. But, you know, we're struggling to raise money for our PAC. I'm not sure what we can do. I was thinking of having a giant contest, you know, and I'm going to, you know, trip to Jamaica, 3, you know, big screen TVs. You know, that's okay. Yes?
I love Cindy's budgets. They're great.
Well, before we get to sort of the prizes and different activities you can do to raise money for a PAC, I think it's important to determine who can be solicited. So that really depends on the structure of the organization. If a corporation has a connected PAC, a separate segregated fund, or really any membership organization or trade association, as far as the folks who can be solicited, it's really the restricted class primarily. That's what you're really focusing on. For a corporation, so for that C4, that includes salaried employees who are, you know, executives making policy, managerial responsibilities. You have stockholders. You have board of directors if they are compensated in some way, and then the family members of all those groups, as well as members of the recognized profession. That's for a corporation. For a membership organization, it's a little bit different. It kind of depends also on who the members are. So for individual member organizations, if this organization has a separate segregated fund, the individual members are members of the restricted class and can be solicited for contributions. Like a corporation, the executive and administrative personnel of the organization can be solicited, and the family members as well. Now,
so you're saying that just regular employees, you know, I work for this environmental organization, every single person is passionate about this, but we can't ask them to, you know, if they're not like the head of a department?
It's not necessarily the heads of departments. It's just folks who are first of all, they have to be salaried, and they have to be
salaried, not hourly.
Right. Or they have to be in a managerial or policy-making position. That doesn't necessarily mean to be the director of policy for a particular organization. It can mean kind of the upper echelon of the team can be solicited as part of the restricted class.
One thing, when you're thinking about your environmental organization, Cindy, if your employees are also members, you could solicit those employees as the members. So even your hourly admin, if he or she's a member, would fit in the membership category.
And as part of being an employee, I just gave everybody a free lifetime membership. Does that work?
No.
$10 a year?
That would work. So there are rules for who are considered to be members. The FEC has a different variety of tests. One of them is either you pay an annual membership dues. Another option would be that you have a role in the governance. So if you can have a free membership category. If they can elect a member of the board or part of the board, there's a variety of different parts.
Thank you, but I'm taking my $10, not going for elect the board.
Exactly.
So the next piece includes corporate membership organizations. So membership organizations that have corporations as part of their member pool, which includes incorporated trade associations. And I know that sort of the bane of the existence of many trade association PACs is the prior approval issue, which frankly is kind of, in my opinion, kind of borderline unconstitutional. However, it still remains law. And so as far as corporate membership organizations and trade association folks who have corporate members, the non-corporate members can be solicited. So if individuals are members of that particular trade association's membership, they can be solicited, as well as the executive administrative personnel like a corporation or an individual membership organization. And then you get to the piece where corporate members, how are they able to be solicited? How is the trade association or the corporate membership organizations, PAC, able to solicit the corporate members restricted class? And that boils down to prior approval. And it's a process by which a trade association PAC will need to get approval, written approval from their corporate members or from a corporate representative prior to actually soliciting that corporation's restricted class. And one of the big issues with trade associations has been for a while is the fact that if a corporation is a member of numerous trade associations, and there's a lot of them out there, they can only provide prior approval to one trade association PAC to have their restricted class be solicited. So, it presents a problem with a lot of trade association PACs not being able to solicit some of their deep-pocketed members in their restricted class, which can be thousands of people, just because of this prior approval law. It's been toiled with both on the legislative side, as far as getting rid of it. There hasn't been any kind of lawsuits yet, but I think it's kind of ripe for overturning that requirement.
This is probably the dumbest rule in all of political law.
Really? There's so much competition.
Yes, in a crowded field, this is probably the worst. I think it really, people get confused about what has to be done. It really limits your ability to communicate with members. This one association per company per year rule it was created in the 1970s when there was sort of a labor management divide that doesn't quite exist in the same way, and so it was sort of a balancing mechanism. It really feels very outdated, and it also feels outdated in the world of digital communication. Before, it's very much you send the prior approval, you can include a sample solicitation form, but it's a two-step process. It feels really awkward to design websites that collect prior approval first and then but include a sample solicitation, so it's really difficult these days.
Agreed, and it definitely can be tedious as far as setting up a website to enable restricted class members to actually make a donation to a trade association PAC, and that kind of gets to the actual logistics of prior approval. So it needs to be in writing. That can be an email. That can be a letter. It can also be in a number of other ways. So a request can be posted on a website. It can be, one other example is if a trade association has a convention every year, they can set up a booth where they can get prior approval from their members there. They can also put it into a newsletter. The FEC has approved all those ways to get prior approval other than just sending out an email to the corporate representative.
One of my favorite things I've seen is a card with a QR code on it, so that, let's say you're at a board meeting and you want to get prior approval from some of your member companies. You hand out the card, they take their phone, they take a picture, and it pulls up a website that has the ability to give prior approval. I thought that was one of the more clever things I've seen. Actually, if you can go back for a second on that one, Jim, I think a question I get a lot of times is, okay, so I've sent out prior approval, I included a sample solicitation form with it, and I got back 10 checks, but no prior approval. Am I allowed to accept those checks? And the answer is actually yes. This is part of the reason why this is the dumbest rule ever, is that it deals with communication. And so you can send out the prior approval, you send out the sample solicitation, and it doesn't matter that you don't have prior approval. What you want to do is document the fact that you did send out prior approval, so that if the FEC were ever to audit, you'd be able to say, yeah, we sent out prior approval forms, but we got back checks instead of prior approval forms. That's perfectly fine. So if you have that situation where you have the member company that maybe has given prior approval to a different trade association, they can still give you a check. That's permissible. That's sort of the middle tier there. The other thing that sometimes happens, while you're not allowed to solicit for PAC contributions from your member companies are allowed to give you PAC contributions. Again, it's all about the communication. So you send out the prior approval, sample solicitation form. Your member company may say, you know what, we have our own PAC. I don't want you meddling with my fundraising, but here's a $5,000 check from our PAC to your PAC. Can you take that? the answer is sure, you're allowed to take it. You're just not allowed to ask for it. So that's, again, why it's such a ridiculous rule. And then the top option there, sort of the straight line rule or approach, is they actually sign the prior approval, and then you can send solicitations. And this is, I find it's difficult to accomplish because member companies don't like you to communicate with people who they think they're opening the box to just sort of spamming all their employees all the time. So what I found is useful is sometimes to include a list of, tell us who you want us to solicit. So it's the 10 employees who kind of work with the association, or it's the top management that work with the association. It's not everybody. Or you could say, you know what, send me as the member company, send me the materials, and we'll distribute it to the employees who we want to solicit after we give it prior approval, and then you can get the contributions in. So that's those are kind of the real world scenarios of how prior approval actually plays out.
So kind of building on the concept of solicitation, what is solicitation? It's not just explicitly asking for money. So if an executive asks a member corporation for, directly for money, or sends out a written email, that's obviously a solicitation. But having things on a website or promoting the PAC, the trade association PAC, in some way can also constitute solicitation. And so I think that trade associations need to be careful with that, especially in the context of if there is mention of a PAC on the trade association's website, the portion of the website that actually has the ability to donate and actually solicits the money needs to be password protected. The FEC has said that part needs to be password protected. There can be a couple of paragraphs or a description of what the PAC is and what their expenditures might be to support certain candidates, but the actual solicitation of the funds cannot be just to the general public. It can only be to the restricted class. And that kind of goes here with what is not a solicitation. Announcing the existence of a PAC, that's not a solicitation. Explaining kind of the legal rules and overview of it is not solicitation. Information about receipts and disbursements, which are all publicly disclosed anyway, is not solicitation. And then the request for prior approval in the first place is not a solicitation.
And I think that's an important one, too, is that some people, because it's a legal requirement, they see the request for prior approval as a very sterile sort of request. There's nothing that says it has to be that way. You can encourage people. You can say, look, the PAC is really important. It advances our goals, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. All the things you would typically say in a solicitation, as long as the call to action is, and we need you to sign this prior approval in order to be able to solicit you. And, oh, by the way, here's our sample solicitation materials that come with it. So I think it's important to think about that prior approval as a pitch document itself, not as just sort of a very legalese kind of sign this here document. I think it's an important distinction to make.
And one thing I'll also add is once a member corporation does provide prior approval, and this can also apply for administrative and executives actually at the association. Their HR departments can set up a payroll deduction program whereby funds will go directly into the PAC through their respective payroll systems.
So now, Cindy, we've figured out who we can solicit and how we can solicit them. Now we get to the fun part of your prizes.
Yeah, trip to Jamaica.
So there's sort of prizes are allowed. There's charitable match, which we'll talk about. The key concept here is that you're not allowed to reimburse for the PAC contribution. So if I make a $5,000 contribution to your PAC, you can't give me something worth $5,000 in value because the FEC says, well, now you've just sort of washed the corporate money there. You certainly can't reimburse me directly. You can't give me a bonus check. You can't up my compensation by the $5,000 that I give. And what's amazing is that for the lack of black letter law in this area, the one that's pretty clear is the no reimbursement rule, and it's the one that people still do all the time. It's amazing to me the number of criminal prosecutions for reimbursing campaign contributions, more on the candidate side than on the PAC side, but the PAC side it applies just as well. You can't reimburse a contribution. So just keep that in mind. If they take anything from today, it's they don't reimburse the contributions. But while you're not reimbursing, you can certainly do some prizes and awards. And what the FEC has said is that the way to make sure you're not sort of reimbursing through a prize is what they call the 1/3 rule. So I'll explain exactly what that means in just a second, but basically, if you're a trade association or other membership organization, the thing to keep in mind is your members are allowed to donate prizes. So even if a trade association with corporate members, for example, the corporations can't give to your PAC. That would be an impermissible corporate contribution, but a member company could give pay for the trip. They could pay for whatever other prizes want to be given, but it has to come from a member. And then it all has to fit the 1/3 rule. So like I promised not to talk too much about the tax code. I promise not to do too much math here, but we do need to do a little bit. So the idea here is that the value of the prize has to be worth less than 1/3 the value of the contribution. If it exceeds that ratio, then the PAC has to pay for the extra. So if a member company donates something, a prize, and it exceeds the 1/3 ratio, the PAC would have to repay, oddly enough, the trade association or the member company for that excess value, so that you're taking those hard dollars out of there so that it doesn't cause you to violate the 1/3 rule. And then the question is, well, 1/3 of what is always what people come back with. And so the universe of the contributions that you count is important. And the big difference is if your trip is going to be give everyone who donates a trip would be different than if you do it as a prize. And so if you're doing a raffle, let's use the example of, everyone who contributes in the next week is eligible to win this prize. And you receive $1,200 in contributions this week. So your universe is $1,200, so the prize can be worth no more than $400. Let's say you said everyone who gives this year will be eligible to win the trip to Jamaica. So maybe you raise a lot of money that way, and the trip to Jamaica is worth $5,000. As long as you raised $15,000 from everybody in the course of the year, your trip to Jamaica would actually work. So I get to say yes to you on that one.
Because the math that you're doing is 1/3.
Exactly, and that I can actually do in my head. Gifts are different. So if it's every single contributor gets a gift, you think it has to be a one-on-one basis. So if there happened to be a snazzy pen that were worth $10, then each contributor would have to give $30, or you'd have the 1/3 rule problem. So that's where what I find is that people often give everyone a trinket, or they do a raffle so that it solves the 1/3 rule problem. Auctions are another option to do that way. There's, I think, a little bit of different ways to count auctions, whether it's an item-by-item issue or whether it's a gross take of the auction in total. One way probably lets you satisfy the 1/3 rule. One may be more complicated depending on the value of the prizes that may have been donated for the auction. And then there's another piece to consider about all of the raffles, and that is whether it complies with state gambling laws, state lottery laws. Many states have exemptions for political committee raffles, just like charities can do different raffles. Then there's also the practical piece, is that if you're doing a big PAC raffle at your convention in Las Vegas, it's much more likely to be a problem, because in Las Vegas they care about unsanctioned gambling, than if you were to do a small sort of internal event, shall we say, or internal reward. I've not seen prosecutions or even issues with that. Not to say that it complies with the law exactly, but it has never really been an issue that I've seen.
It just seems like if you don't know how much money you're going to raise, you don't know what you can give as a prize, but you want to be able to announce the prize to induce people to give. So you start with a trip to Jamaica, and if you only raise $300, it's just a one-day trip to Jamaica. And if you raise more, you can add on the days. I mean, that just seems
I think
it's challenging.
It is challenging. I think that the way I often think about it is to maybe start small with the prize for your first year of your PAC raffle, and then kind of see where people go and how much excitement you can bring. I think also knowing sort of your contributor base and who's contributing and how much they're going to give. If your typical contributor gives $20 a year to the PAC, you're going to need a lot of contributors to get to your Jamaica trip. If you're talking about sort of the CEOs of your member companies who typically write $5,000 checks, that might be easier to get to the Jamaica level sooner rather than later.
Okay.
And it's also, that would be one where it may be that if you had a fundraising month where you had the raffle, if maybe the CEOs all make their contributions in that month, and then you do a broad drive so that you've got the right ratio and the right numbers there to do it. So you can work the math to make it work and come up with your Jamaica trip that I know you're dying to give away. The last example of an incentive is one that is actually quite popular and a lot of people use is the charitable match. So the charitable match is not subject to the 1/3 rule, which is great. So you don't have to do that math. You're allowed to make a donation to a charity to match a variety of different ratios of the PAC contribution. The key is that the donor does not get a tax deduction. So if I make a $5,000 PAC contribution, it's matched to the charity either from my company or the association. I don't get to deduct that $5,000 because PAC contributions are not deductible, and I'm not making the contribution to the charity. And what the IRS has actually said is that the company who's making the contribution, so if it's a for-profit company, this comes into play. It's not a deductible, it's not a charitable deduction either, and it's not a deductible business expense because it's a political expense that you're making to encourage people to contribute to your PAC. So it's a not necessarily a tax favorable contribution, but it's one that can encourage people to give because what they say is, look, I want to, I have X dollars I'm going to give. I'll give it to your PAC knowing that same amount is going to go to a charity. So that could be an advantage. So far, the FEC in advisory opinions has said a 1-for-1 match is fine. And they actually had an enforcement case a couple years ago where the company was giving a 2-for-1 match, and the FEC's found that there's no violation, that it still met with the rules. So 2-for-1 match is okay as well under the FEC rules. So you can really really encourage people that the charity will benefit if they make a PAC contribution.
Just two quick questions. For charitable match, are there typical organizations, association companies size that would lend themselves to doing this and those who shouldn't think about it? Does it really matter?
No, I think it's more of knowing, well, a couple of things. One is knowing your resources to make the match. So much like Cindy's example of where you don't actually have enough PAC contributions to give the trip to Jamaica to fit the 1/3 rule, if you have a ton of people suddenly give to the PAC and you don't have the money to, in the budget to match, you've got to kind of get a sense of what people are doing there. I find probably a lot of your member companies, if you're trade associations, are the ones who do the charitable match the most often. I have seen some associations do it with their PACs, so they just have to make sure they've got enough money. And the other thing is that if you have a related foundation, you're actually allowed to make the donation to the related foundation. You can structure the program in a variety of ways. So it could either be you pick the charity, or you could say we will make a charitable match to our association's foundation if you have a related foundation. You can limit that as well. So a lot of options.
And on the other example of the 1/3 rule, let's say at an event we raise $7,000 in PAC contributions. The 1/3 rule, would it be the 1/3, the cost would be, the total cost of all the items, the trinkets, would be 1/3 of that, or each item? So like we raise $7,000, would the total cost of all the gifts have to be 1/3 of that?
So if you're doing gifts, you do it on a 1-for-1. You say, okay, this donor gave me $99, so I could give a gift worth $33. If it's the drawing, then you do the total amount raised. And so what a lot of times it may be that you could say, anyone who gives $100 or more is eligible for this gift because it's $33. And so the low donors don't get the prize because it wouldn't satisfy the 1/3 rule. So hopefully you have a nice big PAC now, Cindy, because you've learned all about how you can do that.
I do, but all of my best friends have a super PAC, and all I ever read about is super PAC. So I don't want just a PAC. I want a super PAC.
Well, they are popular these days. So, so this is I think the fifth federal election since Citizens United, and
the Supreme Court decision.
Supreme Court decision, Citizens United v. FEC, and its progeny, this DC Circus speech now v. FEC, which allowed corporations, Citizens United allowed corporations to participate in express advocacy communications in support of or in opposition to candidates. And speech now v. FEC took another step and allowed super PACs, the birth of super PACs, basically, independent committees that could do the same thing as corporations, but could just band together a whole bunch of money and do it out of a regular PAC that's registered with the FEC. So Citizens United allows trade associations, corporations to do independent expenditures just out of their general treasury funds. That has not happened as much, I think, as some of the detractors from Citizens United have anticipated. I think a lot of it has been done either through super PACs or through 501c4s. A super PAC can do a number of different things. It's generally used to do express advocacy communications, so vote for or vote against, or its functional equivalent, so words that don't necessarily say vote for or vote against, but there's no other reasonable interpretation to, from a certain communication. So it can support or oppose candidates. It can take a number of different methods of communication: radio, TV, digital, social media, paid social media ads. It can also do get out the vote activities, data operations. Some of those activities don't trigger as much reporting as if there was communications that actually expressly advocated for certain candidates. But again, a super PAC can do those activities, and they're doing them more so these days as well.
I think when super PAC started, there was much more of just they would take on the TV burden because that was the expensive part, which is why we had a few elections where you'd have ad for candidate, ad opposing candidate, ad from super PAC, ad from other super PAC back to the TV show. And that just became less effective. And so now they are starting to do more and more of the data, the field operations, the get out the vote kind of efforts. So there's a lot you can do there on that front. And I actually should add one other thing, though. For all the great independent expenditures, make sure if you're a C3, you can't do them. That campaign intervention rule still applies above and beyond. So what we're talking about here are really the C4s, the C5s, the C6s of the world that can be involved in this space.
Yep, absolutely. Those rules still definitely apply. So as far as independent expenditures go, they obviously cannot be coordinated. And I think that there's kind of a general misunderstanding about what coordination really is. The media kind of has it one way. If you're a lobbyist organization, a trade association, and you have a conversation about certain legislation or policy with a member of Congress, and then later on you decide to do an independent expenditure a couple months later in support of that candidate or in opposition to his or her opponent, that's coordinated because you had that conversation about policy a couple months back. That's not the case. The rules, and I'm not going to get totally into them, but it's a three-pronged test to determine whether a particular communication is coordinated. There's payment, conduct, and content. The payment is obvious if an outside group pays for it. That fulfills that prong. Content, if the ad expressly advocates for or against a candidate. And then the real analysis kind of happens under the conduct prong. And I'm not going to get too into that, but the gist of it is a candidate cannot or candidate or an agent of a candidate cannot give strategic, private, material information to a super PAC or an outside group that is later used in an independent expenditure.
Right, and just to be clear, on coordination, we're talking about coordination between the organization and the campaign of a candidate.
That's correct.
Exactly. One area where sometimes this does come into play, this slide obviously has a lot of information, but the common vendor is a situation you want to be careful of. So if the candidate has hired a media firm or a digital firm or a strategy firm or a polling firm, and your organization, whether you're a C4, C5, a C6, or a super PAC that one of these organizations has created, if the entity funding the independent expenditures uses the same vendor as the candidate, then obviously there's an easy way for information to flow between the two and circumvent these rules. So the FEC says you have to have a firewall. So if you have the same polling firm, you'd have to have one pollster within the firm doing the candidate's work, another pollster doing the independent expenditure work, and the two of them can't talk to one another, so they're not sharing the information of the polls. Same way if you could have the same TV, same media consultant, but again, they'd have to be different people within that firm doing the work. And it's also a former employee situation. So if one of the strategists from the campaign leaves and wants to come work at your super PAC that you've set up, there are cooling off periods in place for 128 days to make sure they don't use material non-public information. So those are a couple of particular rules that come into play that you want to be really careful about. And then the other one I think that's interesting is the republication prong here. So you're not allowed to republish a candidate's materials. Now, in the old days, that would have been sort of easy to figure out. You can't take the full ad and just tell the station to rerun the ad. Now, of course, everything is done digitally. So what does it mean if you go to the campaign's website and download a high-res photograph of the candidate to stick in your commercial? Or what if the campaign happens to have put a bunch of B-roll footage of the candidate kissing babies and shaking hands up on the website? And what the FEC has said is, and it's very interesting, I think, is that you can use those materials as long as you're using them to create your own ad and not just repackaging the candidate's ad. These have been very contentious decisions by the FEC. There's not a lot of good, clear guidance there, but certainly the campaigns put up these materials, and as long as they're publicly available, some campaigns, I think, play with that more than others in terms of what it means to be publicly available. And, gee, if you happen to know this crazy little URL to get to, might not be publicly available, but if it's a link from the website of candidate footage, it's generally going to be okay, and you can use that to put that in your ads so that it's you actually have footage of the candidate. So it's an important thing to keep in mind.
I think that's absolutely right, and I think the notion of what is making something public, that's also not fleshed out within the FEC regulations, and I think, or advisory opinions, and I think that a lot of committees these days will put out or do a presentation in front of 5 people. Maybe it's a consultant, maybe it's a member of the state party, maybe it's a member of an organization, and then they consider that made public, and therefore the usage of those materials, or even strategy for that matter, can arguably be used by an outside group to do an independent expenditure. Of course, there's sort of risk tolerance here, and there's also optics, like I spoke about earlier, but that has been the trend lately about making things public in order to have an outside group use them ultimately. I think with regard to, let me get to the next slide here. So disclosure of independent expenditures. If you're a super PAC, you're already registered with the FEC, or if you have a state level super PAC, you're presumably registered with the state agency. A couple of states don't even require registration or reporting for federal committees doing work in certain states, doing work, supporting a governor or gubernatorial candidate or another state candidate. They don't even need to register or report. For instance, Ohio, you can use a federal super PAC and expressly advocate all you want, and you don't have to register or report with the state because there's an exemption for federal committees. With that said, a super PAC that is registered with the FEC needs to file independent expenditure reports in addition to their regular quarterly reporting. And depending on how close in proximity you are to the election, whether it's a primary or general, you need to file either a 24 or 48-hour independent expenditure report. If you are an organization that's not registered as a political committee or a super PAC with the FEC, you would also need to file these 24 and 48-hour reports. If it's express advocacy, it's one kind of report. If it is something called an electioneering communication, so these are ads, broadcast, cable, or satellite ads that may not advocate for a certain candidate at all. Doesn't say vote for or vote against. Does not contain express advocacy. A lot of times these kind of ads are considered issue ads, but the proximity with the election is key here, because if it's 60 days before a primary or 30 days before a primary, 60 days before a general, if you put up a television ad that just mentions a candidate or depicts a candidate, that would trigger the need to file an electioneering communications report with the Federal Election Commission.
So in a minute, we're going to talk about some of the state disclosure rules, but up here, I think one of the most interesting things to keep in mind is if you are a C4, C5, or C6 organization, and you are raising money for an independent expenditure effort from your members or others, the third bullet there in the periodic reports, disclose contributions of more than $200 received for the purpose of furthering the reported independent expenditure. So this is kind of the world of dark money, where people get very skeptical, or people exercising their First Amendment rights without putting themselves on display. There's all sorts of different ways to look at it. But the key here is if you're an organization that raises money for a political program generally, that will not have to be disclosed if you're not a super PAC registered with the FEC. But if you say, hey, Jim, we're doing these independent expenditures to support Cindy's college roommate, would you be willing to make a contribution so that we can do that? Then I'm going to have to disclose Jim as a donor, because that's a contribution was made for the purposes of furthering the reported independent expenditure. If you are a C6 and there's a super PAC out there that you want to support, and you say, hey, Jim, would you give us some money? We've got some political activities. The C6 gives to the super PAC. The C6 would be listed as the donor. But if you said to Jim, hey, Jim, will you make a contribution to us so that we can make a contribution to the super PAC to fund those independent expenditures, then it's sort of a pass-through. And the FEC there have been some fights at the FEC about exactly what triggers that disclosure, but basically there would have to be disclosure up through there. And there's a couple of situations recently where the nonprofits on their 990s showed sort of a pass-through contribution, but argued that it wasn't a pass-through contribution at the FEC, and they said it doesn't quite work that way. So you want to be very careful about how you're raising that money, because it may be that you want your donors may want to contribute to the 501c organization for that anonymity, but you've got to do the fundraising correctly and not just have it be a straight through pass-through to protect that anonymity.
I know we're going to run out of time. We have one more hypothetical to talk about. And we're also getting some online questions, and one of which I'm going to ask here, which is, so we keep talking about super PACs. How does that relate to the IRS rules? Who are these super PACs? And I think many of them are 501c4s, but they can be others.
Yeah, so super PACs typically are going to be 527 organizations. That's the part of the tax code they're going to fall under. They can receive contributions from C4s. C4s, so the thing is C4s and C6s, C5s, they're all allowed to make independent expenditures. So you can either do it directly from the C organization, or they could fund a super PAC. So there's sort of the different ways of accomplishing what you want to do. And it depends on some of the anonymity. It depends on how you're going to raise the money. It depends on that 527F tax that I talked about before and how you're going to deal with that if you have a lot of investment income. So the C4s and the C6s can do it themselves, or they could create a super PAC and fund the super PAC.
Here's another one. When can a candidate or an office holder be at a 501c4 fundraiser if the 501c4 engages in election activity? Can the candidate make a fundraising solicitation at this event?
So you're talking about a 501c4 event.
I'm just channeling this person, but yes.
So I think the rules apply as far as an organization hosts. It really depends on who's going to be there, right? So if a 501c4 or some sort of an organization has a fundraising event for a candidate there and only has a restricted class there, in that case, the candidate can make solicitations as long as the employees and folks at the organization don't actually receive the contributions for the individual. I think if the C4 is hosting an event for the general public, that's not something that a candidate could go and get up and raise money in the front of the room.
You could also have a scenario where if the C4 is raising money to do its independent expenditures, so it's sort of raising money for the IEs, the candidate could be there. You have to be careful about the coordination rules, but one of the interesting things with coordination is that it typically focuses on the outputs, not the inputs. So you can have a candidate at an event to raise money for a super PAC or a C4, as long as you're not sharing non-public information at that event, and as long as the candidate is not asking for unlimited contributions, because this is another one of those what can you say, not what can you do rules. Federal candidates are subject to limits on how much they can solicit. So they could get up to the front of the room and say, this C4 is doing great work. I love them. I hope you'll write a large check to the C4 or to the super PAC. Then they leave the room, and then the president of the C4 says, okay, get out your checkbooks. We can take unlimited individual and corporate contributions. So we look forward to your support, as long as the candidate doesn't make that pitch. And so that's another, I think, maybe beginning to what that questioner was getting to.
I think you can talk very briefly at a high level about the next slides, which really are about the fact that so much is happening, given the federal gridlock, as I said, so much is happening at the state and local level. So what are the state and local rules?
Absolutely. So you can do independent expenditures everywhere. The structure, as Jim mentioned, can be different. Sometimes you can use a federal super PAC. Sometimes New York is an example of a state where you have to register a particular kind of super PAC in the state. They have rules about accepting contributions from PACs in New York. It really is bizarre. And then also the coordination rules differ. So California is a good example, like it is in so many things, of states where the regulation is different than sort of the federal or more complicated. So I have a couple slides here. I'm not going to go through the details, but basically what it comes down to is that California has what I call upstream disclosure. It has very tight rules about how, if a 501c4 or a super PAC makes an independent expenditure in California, it requires registration by the committees giving to that entity, and then upstream from there, so that at the end of the day, it's very hard to set up a super PAC in California or a C4 where you would have true anonymity of the donors. California's enforced its rules. They've gone to court to enforce the rules, and so you want to be very careful about promising your donors to a C4 that's going to support California candidates anonymity, as you could likely do in a federal scenario where you carefully structure the solicitation. And then the other thing that the states have done, in many states, they've created what's called the presumption of coordination. So they create different categories of activity that is presumed to be coordinated unless you rebut the presumption. I've never quite understood exactly how you rebut the presumption. Here, for example, if a candidate participates in fundraising or appears as a speaker at a fundraiser, so what I said was okay at the federal level. In California, that's the presumption of coordination, and it's not clear what you would have to present to rebut that presumption of coordination. And if it's coordinated, it means it's an in-kind contribution. And in California, like at the gubernatorial level, it's limited to $29,000. So if your TV buy exceeded $29,000, which it would almost have to be on TV anywhere, you would have an impermissible excessive contribution. So that's the whirlwind tour of the state concepts here. But it's important basically to know that each state is going to be different. Think about which state you want to be in, and then look at the rules there.
Right, and I just want to mention, since we were talking about these super PACs, and you'll remember the last election session, your TVs were totally taken over by ad after ad after ad after ad. And there's a very timely comic in today's Washington Post, shows a bunch of devils sitting around a table, and it's called the Hades brainstorming session. It says, what if we put a TV in every room, but all it shows is campaign commercials? So, yes, that is many of our definition of hell these days. So, and it's not getting better with the amount of money that's flowing in. Well, thank you very much for that tour of a lot of, especially FEC rules, more on what people can do outside the 501c3 context, but even C3s can get there through the C4 to PAC rule. So hope you all join me in thanking our speakers.
Thank you for coming today.
All right, thanks, and hopefully we'll see you in June for our non-rainy rooftop reception.